Some people believe that wealth corrupts the soul, but I never understood how deep that corruption could run until I witnessed a man lose everything he thought defined him, only to discover who he truly was through the eyes of someone he'd never bothered to see. This is the story of how a single moment changed two lives forever, and how sometimes the person who knows us best is the one we've overlooked the most. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Blackstone Industries headquarters as Victoria Henley pushed her cleaning cart through the executive wing. It was barely 6 in the morning and the 43rd floor was empty except for the soft hum of expensive machinery and the distant sound of early traffic from the streets of Chicago far below. Victoria preferred these quiet hours before the chaos began, when she could work in peace without dodging important people who looked through her as if she were invisible. She had been cleaning these offices for 3 years, arriving before dawn and leaving by mid-morning, a ghost in the corporate machine. Her uniform was always pressed, her graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, and her movements efficient and purposeful. At 52, Victoria had perfected the art of being present but unnoticed, essential but ignored. The corner office belonged to Alexander Blackstone, the 38-year-old CEO who had inherited the technology empire from his father and transformed it into one of the most ruthless corporations in the industry. Victoria knew his schedule better than his own assistant did. He arrived at exactly 7:30 every morning, left for lunch at precisely noon, and rarely departed before 10 at night. He drank his coffee black, preferred his newspapers folded in thirds, and had never once acknowledged her existence beyond an occasional grunt when she was forced to clean around him. Alexander Blackstone was the kind of man who measured his worth in stock prices and quarterly reports. His office was a shrine to his success, with awards lining the walls, photos of him shaking hands with politicians and celebrities, and a view that cost more per square foot than most people made in a year. He lived in a penthouse apartment that had been featured in architectural magazines, drove cars that cost more than most people's homes, and surrounded himself with people who either feared him or wanted something from him. Victoria had observed him long enough to know that beneath the expensive suits and commanding presence was a man who had forgotten how to be human. She had watched him fire employees over email, cut benefits to increase profits, and treat his staff like disposable assets. He spoke to people in clipped, impatient tones, as if every conversation was an interruption to more important matters. His personal life seemed equally hollow. Victoria had seen the parade of society women who came and went, none lasting more than a few months, all seeming more interested in his bank account than his personality. This particular morning felt different, though Victoria couldn't put her finger on why. Perhaps it was the storm clouds gathering outside, or the tension she had sensed in the building the previous week. There had been whispers among the staff about a major acquisition deal, something that would make Alexander even wealthier and more powerful. The cleaning staff often knew more about company business than they let on, picking up fragments of conversations and reading between the lines of discarded documents. As Victoria worked her way through the reception area outside Alexander's office, she noticed his assistant Margaret had left her computer screen on. This was unusual, as Margaret was typically meticulous about security protocols. On the screen was an email thread about something called Project Tabula Rasa, a name that made Victoria pause. Her daughter had studied Latin in college, and Victoria remembered enough to know it meant blank slate. The email mentioned a research facility, experimental procedures, and substantial financial backing from Blackstone Industries. Victoria quickly looked away and continued her work. It wasn't her business what deals Alexander was making, but something about the name unsettled her. She had learned long ago that when rich men started playing with experimental anything, ordinary people usually paid the price. At exactly 7:30, Alexander Blackstone stepped off the private elevator, his presence filling the space like an expensive cologne. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Victoria made in 3 months, his dark hair perfectly styled, his expression set in its usual mask of cold efficiency. He barely glanced in her direction as he strode toward his office, already speaking into his phone about market positions and merger deadlines. Victoria had been emptying wastebaskets near his office when she heard raised voices coming from inside. Alexander was on a conference call, and even through the heavy oak door, his voice carried the sharp edge of anger. "I don't care what the FDA says," he was saying. "We've invested too much in this technology to let regulatory concerns slow us down. Find another facility, another country if necessary. This procedure will revolutionize memory therapy, and I'll be damned if I let bureaucratic red tape cost me billions." Victoria paused in her work, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. Memory therapy sounded innocent enough, but Alexander's tone suggested something far more sinister. She had heard that tone before when he spoke about hostile takeovers and competitor elimination. It was the voice of a man who would crush anything that stood between him and what he wanted. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Alexander becoming increasingly agitated. Victoria learned that the project involved experimental memory manipulation technology, something that could supposedly erase traumatic memories and replace them with artificial ones. Alexander seemed particularly interested in the military applications, talking about soldiers who could be programmed to follow orders without question, their inconvenient consciences wiped clean. When the call ended, Alexander emerged from his office like a storm cloud, his face flushed with anger. Margaret tried to approach him with his morning schedule, but he waved her away with such force that she actually stepped backward. Victoria had seen him angry before, but this was different. This was the fury of a man whose grand plans were being threatened. "Cancel everything until noon," he barked at Margaret. "I'm going to the research facility. If anyone asks, I'm in meetings all morning." He stormed toward the elevator, leaving a wake of tension behind him. Margaret looked shaken, her hands trembling slightly as she rearranged papers on her desk. Victoria continued her work, but her mind was racing. She had a bad feeling about where Alexander was going and what he planned to do there. 3 hours later, Victoria was finishing her work on the 42nd floor when she heard the commotion upstairs. Emergency sirens were wailing outside, and people were running toward the elevators. Margaret was on the phone, her voice high and panicked. "Yes, this is Margaret Chen from Blackstone Industries," she was saying. "Our CEO was involved in an accident at the research facility. He's being taken to Northwestern Memorial Hospital." Victoria's blood went cold. She abandoned her cleaning cart and took the stairs to the executive floor, her heart pounding with each step. The normally pristine reception area was chaos, with executives shouting into phones and assistants crying at their desks. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Victoria could see news vans already gathering in the street below. What happened? Victoria asked Margaret, who was sitting at her desk with tears streaming down her face. Margaret looked up in surprise. In 3 years, this was perhaps the first time Victoria had spoken directly to her. "There was an explosion at the research facility," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Blackstone was in the building when it happened. They said—" She paused, struggling to find the words. "They said there was some kind of experimental equipment that malfunctioned. He has severe head trauma, and they don't know if he'll survive." Victoria felt a strange mix of emotions. She had no love for Alexander Blackstone, had seen him destroy lives and treat people like pawns in his corporate games. But she also knew that no one deserved to suffer, and the thought of anyone lying broken and alone in a hospital bed stirred something maternal in her heart. "Which hospital?" Victoria asked. "Northwestern Memorial," Margaret replied, then looked confused. "But why do you—" Victoria was already walking away, her mind made up. She couldn't explain why, but she felt compelled to go to the hospital. Perhaps it was her Catholic upbringing, the belief that everyone deserved compassion in their darkest hour. Or perhaps it was simple human decency, something that seemed to be in short supply in Alexander's world. The hospital was a maze of sterile corridors and beeping machines. Victoria had to convince 3 different nurses that she was Alexander's employee before they would tell her anything about his condition. He was in intensive care, they said, with severe traumatic brain injury. The doctors were cautiously optimistic about his survival, but the extent of his neurological damage wouldn't be known for days or weeks. Victoria found herself sitting in the ICU waiting room, surrounded by people who looked nothing like her. Alexander's business associates began arriving within hours, all expensive suits and hushed conversations about stock prices and succession planning. His lawyer came with a briefcase full of documents. A parade of society acquaintances made brief appearances, more concerned with being seen than actually caring about Alexander's condition. But as the hours passed, Victoria noticed something telling. Despite Alexander's wealth and power, despite the hundreds of employees who depended on him and the social circles he moved in, he was fundamentally alone. The business associates left when visiting hours ended. The lawyer departed once he'd secured the necessary legal protections. The society friends moved on to whatever party or event demanded their attention. Victoria remained. She couldn't explain why she felt responsible for this man, who had never shown her a moment's kindness. Perhaps it was because she understood loneliness, having lost her husband 5 years earlier and watching her children build lives far from Chicago. Perhaps it was because she recognized something in Alexander that others missed, a deep emptiness that all his money couldn't fill. On the third day, the doctors delivered news that would change everything. Alexander was awake, but the head trauma had caused severe amnesia. He didn't remember his name, his company, or his life. The experimental equipment he had been examining when the explosion occurred had been designed to manipulate memories, and the irony wasn't lost on Victoria that it had essentially wiped his slate clean. The good news is that his basic cognitive functions appear intact, Dr. Patricia Reeves explained to the assembled group of lawyers and executives. He can speak, reason, and learn new information. But his episodic memory, everything that made him who he was, is gone. He doesn't remember being Alexander Blackstone. The room erupted in chaos. The lawyers immediately began discussing legal implications and power of attorney issues. The business associates started calculating how this would affect stock prices and ongoing deals. The board members whispered about emergency succession plans. Victoria sat quietly in the corner, watching these people dissect Alexander's life, like vultures picking at a carcass. None of them seemed concerned about the man himself, only about what his condition meant for their own interests. When visiting hours began the next day, Victoria was the first person allowed into Alexander's room. She had brought flowers from the hospital gift shop, a small gesture that the nurses told her no one else had bothered to make. Alexander was sitting up in bed, staring out the window with a confused expression. The commanding presence was gone, replaced by something much more vulnerable and human. When he turned to look at her, his eyes held none of the cold calculation she had grown accustomed to. Instead, there was curiosity and a kind of innocent openness that transformed his entire face. "Hello," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Are you one of my doctors?" Victoria set the flowers on his bedside table and pulled up a chair. "No," she said gently. "I'm Victoria. I work at your company." "My company?" Alexander's brow furrowed. "I'm sorry. I don't remember having a company. The doctors say I've lost my memory. They tell me my name is Alexander Blackstone, but that doesn't feel right somehow. It feels like a name that belongs to someone else." Victoria studied his face, seeing something she had never seen before in 3 years of observing him. Without the armor of arrogance and wealth, Alexander looked younger, more genuine. The hard lines around his eyes had softened, and when he smiled, it reached his eyes in a way that his corporate smile never had. "What do you remember?" Victoria asked. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his gaze turning inward. "Fragments," he said finally. "I remember the smell of coffee and old books. I remember someone teaching me to play chess, but I can't see their face. I remember feeling proud of something, but I don't know what. And I remember—" He paused, looking embarrassed. "This sounds strange, but I remember feeling like I was wearing a costume that didn't fit, like I was pretending to be someone I wasn't." Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. In 3 years of watching Alexander Blackstone, she had never heard him speak with such introspection or vulnerability. It was as if the explosion had stripped away not just his memories, but the mask he wore to face the world. "The doctors and lawyers keep telling me about this life I supposedly lived," Alexander continued. "They show me pictures of expensive cars and fancy parties, tell me about business deals and investments. But when I look at those photos, I don't see myself. I see a stranger wearing my face." Over the following days, Victoria found herself returning to the hospital every afternoon after finishing her cleaning shifts. She told herself it was out of Christian charity, but the truth was more complicated. The man in the hospital bed bore little resemblance to the tyrant she had cleaned up after for 3 years. This Alexander was curious about her life, asked about her family, listened when she spoke. He thanked her for the flowers and seemed genuinely pleased when she brought him books from the library. Meanwhile, the vultures circled. Alexander's business empire was in chaos without its ruthless leader. Stock prices fluctuated wildly as rumors spread about his condition. The board was pressuring him to sign documents that would transfer power to a temporary CEO. But Alexander, even without his memories, seemed to sense that something wasn't right. "They want me to sign papers," he told Victoria during one of her visits. "But I don't understand what they're asking me to agree to. They use words like fiduciary responsibility and shareholder value. But when I ask them to explain what that means in simple terms, they get frustrated with me." Victoria had been watching these same people manipulate Alexander's condition for their own benefit, and she found herself in the strange position of wanting to protect the man she had once considered her oppressor. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "Maybe you shouldn't sign anything until you understand it better," she suggested. Alexander nodded thoughtfully. "That's what my instincts tell me too. But they say I'm not thinking clearly because of the accident. They keep showing me documents with my signature on them, telling me this is how I used to do business. But looking at those signatures, looking at the things I apparently agreed to..." He shook his head. "I can't imagine being the kind of person who would approve some of these deals." Victoria knew exactly what he meant. She had seen some of those documents in Alexander's wastebasket. Contracts that displaced entire communities for shopping centers. Deals that eliminated environmental protections for profit. Agreements that moved jobs overseas, while executives received bonuses. One afternoon, Victoria arrived to find Alexander looking particularly troubled. "They brought someone to see me today," he said. "A woman named Clarissa Thornfield. They said she was my fiancée." Victoria remembered Clarissa, a socialite who had been photographed with Alexander at various charity galas. She was beautiful in the way that money could buy, with perfect features enhanced by expensive cosmetic procedures and a wardrobe that cost more than most people's cars. "She seemed nice enough," Alexander continued, "but when she talked about our relationship, it felt like she was describing someone else's life. She mentioned trips to Paris and yacht parties, charity auctions, and country club memberships. She showed me photos of us together, but in every picture, we look like actors posing for a magazine spread. There's no warmth, no genuine connection." Victoria wasn't surprised. She had observed Clarissa during her few visits to Alexander's office, had seen how she looked at him like a prize to be won rather than a person to be loved. "When she kissed me goodbye," Alexander said quietly, "I felt nothing. Shouldn't I feel something for the woman I was supposedly going to marry?" Victoria didn't know how to answer that question. How could she tell him that the woman he was supposed to love had already been seen around town with another wealthy bachelor, hedging her bets in case Alexander's recovery didn't go as planned? As the weeks passed, Victoria found herself spending more and more time at the hospital. She brought Alexander books from the library, simple novels and poetry collections that he devoured with an enthusiasm his former self had never shown for anything beyond financial reports. She told him stories about her late husband, her children, her life in the small apartment she'd called home for 20 years. In return, Alexander shared his thoughts and observations about the world he was supposedly returning to. He talked about how strange it felt to own things he didn't remember buying, to live in a space that felt like a museum rather than a home. He spoke about the emptiness he sensed in the relationships he was told he had cultivated, the transactional nature of interactions with people who claimed to care about him. "Sometimes I wonder if losing my memory was a blessing," he said one afternoon. "Everyone keeps telling me what a successful man I was, but when I ask them if I was happy, they change the subject. When I ask if I was kind, they tell me that kindness is a luxury successful people can't afford." Victoria felt her heart break a little for this lost man who was discovering that his former life had been built on a foundation of sand. She began to understand that the explosion hadn't just erased Alexander's memory, it had given him a chance to see his life with fresh eyes, to recognize the emptiness that money and power had created. But she also knew that the wolves were circling, waiting for their chance to reshape him back into the man they needed him to be. The pressure was mounting for Alexander to return to work, to resume his role as CEO, to sign the documents that would keep the corporate machine running smoothly. "They want me to come back to the office next week," Alexander told her during one visit. "They say it will help trigger my memories, that being in familiar surroundings might bring back who I used to be." Victoria felt a sense of dread settle in her stomach. She had seen what Alexander Blackstone's office represented, the shrine to greed and ambition that had consumed whatever humanity he once possessed. She feared that returning to that environment would corrupt this gentle, curious man who had emerged from the ashes of his former self. "What do you want to do?" she asked. Alexander was quiet for a long time, staring out the hospital window at the city skyline. "I don't know," he said finally. "Part of me is curious about who I was, but another part of me fears what I might discover. What if the person I was before the accident was someone I wouldn't want to be again?" Victoria thought about all the times she had watched Alexander Blackstone destroy lives with casual indifference, all the employees who had been cast aside when they became inconvenient, all the communities that had been displaced for profit. She thought about the man who had never bothered to learn her name despite seeing her nearly every day for 3 years. But she also looked at the man sitting before her now, someone who remembered to say please and thank you, who asked about her arthritis and brought her coffee when she visited, who read poetry and wondered about the meaning of life. This Alexander was everything his former self had never been: humble, kind, genuinely interested in other people's lives. The question that haunted Victoria was whether this transformation was real or temporary. Would returning to his old life inevitably corrupt him again, or was it possible for someone to truly change at their core? As Alexander prepared to leave the hospital and return to his penthouse apartment, Victoria realized that she was about to find out. The test would come when he walked back into Blackstone Industries, when he was surrounded by the people and pressures that had shaped him before. Would he remember who he had been, or would he choose who he wanted to become? Victoria knew that whatever happened next would determine not just Alexander's fate, but the fate of everyone whose lives intersected with his corporate empire. The man who emerged from this trial would either be the ruthless CEO who had terrorized his employees, or the gentle soul who had learned to see the world through different eyes. The only thing Victoria was certain of was that she would be watching, just as she had always watched. But this time, she wouldn't be invisible. This time, she might be the only person who truly knew who Alexander Blackstone really was, beneath the layers of wealth and power. Because sometimes, the person who knows us best is the one we've overlooked the most. And sometimes, losing everything we thought we were is the only way to discover who we were meant to be. The morning Alexander Blackstone was scheduled to return to his office marked exactly 6 weeks since the explosion that had changed everything. Victoria arrived at Blackstone Industries earlier than usual, her stomach churning with anxiety about what the day would bring. She had spent sleepless nights wondering whether the gentle, curious man she had come to know would survive his re-entry into the corporate world that had created his former self. The 43rd floor buzzed with unusual energy as executives and assistants prepared for their CEO's return. Margaret had worked overtime to ensure everything was perfect, from the fresh flowers in his office to the stack of simplified briefings that would supposedly help ease Alexander back into his role. The board members had scheduled a series of meetings designed to gradually reintroduce him to the company's operations, though Victoria suspected their true purpose was to pressure him into signing the documents that would secure their positions and protect their interests. Victoria watched from her cleaning station as Alexander stepped off the private elevator at exactly 9 o'clock, flanked by his doctor, his lawyer, and 2 security guards. The transformation was immediately apparent to anyone who had known him before. Gone was the predatory confidence that had once emanated from every pore. Instead, Alexander moved with careful deliberation, his eyes taking in details he had previously ignored. He paused to examine the paintings on the walls, artwork worth millions that he had never bothered to notice in his previous life. Margaret rushed forward to greet him, her smile bright but nervous. "Welcome back, Mr. Blackstone," she said. "We've prepared everything just as you requested." Alexander smiled warmly at her, a genuine expression that caught Margaret off guard. "Thank you, Margaret. I appreciate all your hard work. I know this situation has been difficult for everyone." The simple acknowledgement and gratitude seemed to stun Margaret, who had worked for Alexander for 5 years without receiving more than perfunctory nods and barked orders. Victoria noticed tears welling in the assistant's eyes as she led Alexander toward his office. As the group passed Victoria's station, Alexander stopped abruptly. "Victoria," he said with obvious pleasure, "I didn't know you worked on this floor." The executives and lawyers turned to stare at Victoria, their faces showing various degrees of confusion and annoyance. Dr. Reeves looked particularly puzzled, as if she were trying to solve a complex equation. "Yes, Mr. Blackstone," Victoria said quietly, acutely aware of the attention focused on her. "I clean these offices every morning." "Of course," Alexander said. "You mentioned that during our conversations at the hospital. I apologize for not connecting it immediately." He turned to address the group surrounding him. "Victoria has been one of the most helpful people during my recovery. She has visited me nearly every day, brought me books, helped me understand things when the medical terminology became overwhelming." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria could see the calculations running behind the eyes of Alexander's advisors as they tried to process this information. A cleaning lady had unprecedented access to their memory-impaired CEO, had been influencing his thoughts and perceptions during his most vulnerable period. She could practically hear their concerns about propriety, security, and potential manipulation. Dr. Reeves was the first to speak. "Mr. Blackstone, while we appreciate that you formed connections during your recovery, it might be wise to focus on re-establishing relationships with your core team and family members. Too many new influences could potentially interfere with your memory restoration process." Alexander's expression shifted, a flicker of the steel that had once defined him appearing in his eyes. "Dr. Reeves, with all due respect, Victoria has been nothing but kind and supportive during the most difficult period of my life. I won't dismiss someone who showed me genuine care, simply because she doesn't fit into your prescribed recovery plan." Victoria felt a surge of emotion at his defense of her, but also a growing concern about the position this put her in. She could already see the hostile glances from the executives, could sense their determination to minimize her influence over Alexander. The group moved into Alexander's office, leaving Victoria to continue her work while straining to hear fragments of conversation through the heavy door. The voices were muffled, but the tone was clear enough. They were presenting Alexander with carefully curated versions of his past, emphasizing his business acumen while downplaying the more ruthless aspects of his leadership style. Victoria knew they were painting a picture of a tough but fair CEO, a man who made difficult decisions for the greater good of the company and its shareholders. They weren't lying exactly, but they were omitting crucial context about the human cost of those decisions. They didn't mention the families displaced by his development projects, the employees fired to boost quarterly profits, or the environmental regulations he had lobbied to weaken. Throughout the morning, Victoria watched a steady stream of people enter and exit Alexander's office. Board members presented financial reports with smiling faces, carefully avoiding mention of the questionable accounting practices that had inflated their numbers. Department heads briefed him on ongoing projects while glossing over the ethical concerns that had been raised and ignored. His legal team discussed pending litigation as if the lawsuits filed by former employees and affected communities were merely nuisances to be managed rather than legitimate grievances to be addressed. During her lunch break, Victoria found herself in the small employee cafeteria on the 32nd floor, a place Alexander had never visited in his previous incarnation. She was surprised when he appeared in the doorway, looking around with genuine curiosity. "I hope you don't mind if I join you," he said, approaching her table with a tray from the cafeteria line. "I wanted to escape from the conference room for a few minutes." Victoria glanced around nervously, aware that every eye in the cafeteria was fixed on them. Alexander Blackstone eating lunch with the cleaning staff was unprecedented, the kind of event that would fuel office gossip for months. "Of course," Victoria said, though she felt increasingly uncomfortable with the attention they were drawing. Alexander sat down and took a bite of what appeared to be a rather ordinary sandwich. "This is surprisingly good," he said. "I keep expecting to remember the foods I used to enjoy, but nothing seems familiar. My assistant told me I used to have lunch brought in from exclusive restaurants, but honestly, this tastes better than anything I've eaten since leaving the hospital." Victoria smiled, despite her nervousness. "Sometimes the simple things are the best." "That seems to be a theme I'm discovering," Alexander said. Everyone keeps showing me pictures of extravagant parties and expensive vacations, telling me about the sophisticated lifestyle I used to lead. But when I look at those images, I feel nothing. When I sit here talking with you, or when I read the books you brought me, I feel more alive than anything in those photographs suggests I ever was. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of James Morrison, the company's chief operating officer, and Alexander's former right-hand man. Morrison was a sharp-featured man in his 50s, who had built his career by anticipating Alexander's needs and executing his directives without question or conscience. "Alexander," Morrison said, his tone carefully modulated to sound casual despite the obvious irritation in his eyes. "We've been looking for you. The board is ready to continue your briefings." Alexander looked up calmly, showing no sign of the intimidation that Morrison's presence might once have inspired in subordinates. "I'm having lunch, James. The briefings can wait 30 minutes. Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, but I should mention that we have some time-sensitive decisions that require your attention. The Riverside Development Project, for instance. The City Council is meeting tomorrow, and without your signature on the final agreements, we could lose the deal entirely." Victoria's blood went cold. She knew about the Riverside Project from conversations she had overheard over the past year. It involved demolishing a low-income housing complex to build luxury condominiums, displacing hundreds of families who had nowhere else to go. The project had been stalled by community protests and legal challenges, but Alexander's legal team had found ways to circumvent the opposition. Alexander frowned thoughtfully. "Remind me about the specifics of this project. What exactly are we building, and what's currently on the site?" Morrison glanced at Victoria, with barely concealed annoyance before answering. "It's a high-end residential development that will significantly increase property values in the area. The current structures are outdated public housing that's been a drain on city resources for decades." "And where will the current residents go?" Alexander asked. Morrison's expression showed his surprise at the question. "That's being handled by the city's relocation services. It's not really our concern once the sale is finalized." Victoria watched Alexander's face carefully, seeing something harden in his expression. "It's not our concern what happens to the people we're displacing?" "Alexander," Morrison said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone, "this is exactly the kind of thinking that made you so successful before your accident. You understood that business sometimes requires difficult decisions, but the greater economic benefit justifies the short-term disruption." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Morrison with an intensity that reminded Victoria of his former self, though the motivation behind it seemed entirely different. "James," he said finally, "I'd like to see the site before I make any decisions about this project." Morrison looked stunned. "See the site? Alexander, you've reviewed all the reports and financial projections. There's no need to—" "I want to see it," Alexander repeated, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "I want to understand exactly what we're doing and who it affects before I put my signature on anything." The tension in the cafeteria was palpable, as Morrison struggled to maintain his composure. "Of course," he said through gritted teeth. "I'll arrange a tour for tomorrow morning." After Morrison left, Alexander turned back to Victoria. "Tell me honestly," he said, "what do you know about this Riverside project?" Victoria hesitated, knowing that her answer could have far-reaching consequences. But looking into Alexander's eyes, seeing the genuine concern there, she made her decision. "I know that 300 families are going to lose their homes," she said quietly. "I know that most of them have lived there for years, that their children go to school in the neighborhood, that many of the elderly residents have nowhere else they can afford to go. I know that the city's relocation assistance is basically a bus ticket and a promise that other housing will become available someday." Alexander absorbed this information with visible distress. "And my former self was comfortable with this?" Victoria nodded reluctantly. "Your former self saw it as a business opportunity. The human cost wasn't part of the equation." That afternoon, Victoria watched as Alexander met with various department heads and board members, his demeanor growing more troubled with each briefing. She could see him struggling to reconcile the man they described with the person he felt himself to be. The disconnect was becoming increasingly obvious, and she could sense his growing resistance to their attempts to mold him back into his former shape. The breaking point came during a meeting with the head of human resources, Karen Winters, who was briefing Alexander on what she termed personnel optimization strategies. Victoria was cleaning just outside the conference room when she heard Alexander's voice rise above the corporate jargon. "You're talking about firing 1,200 people," he said, his voice filled with disbelief. 1,200 people who have families, mortgages, children in college. And you're presenting this as an optimization strategy? Karen's voice remained professionally calm. "Alexander, these are the kinds of decisions that have kept Blackstone Industries profitable even during economic downturns. You've always understood that maintaining competitiveness sometimes requires difficult choices." "Difficult for whom?" Alexander demanded. "Difficult for the executives who get to keep their jobs and their bonuses, or difficult for the workers who get 30 days' notice that their livelihoods are being eliminated." Victoria had never heard Alexander speak with such passion about anything, let alone about the welfare of his employees. She could hear chairs being pushed back, papers being shuffled, the uncomfortable silence that followed his outburst. When the meeting ended, Alexander emerged from the conference room looking shaken and angry. He walked past Victoria without his usual greeting, his face set in grim lines that reminded her of his former self, though the motivation behind the expression was entirely different. Victoria finished her shift and was preparing to leave when Margaret approached her with obvious nervousness. "Victoria," she said, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard, "Mr. Morrison wants to see you in his office before you go." Victoria's heart sank. She had been expecting this confrontation, but that didn't make it any less intimidating. Morrison's office was on the 42nd floor, a space designed to intimidate with its imposing desk, expensive art, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the city. Morrison didn't invite her to sit, leaving her standing before his desk like a defendant before a judge. "Victoria," he began, his voice carrying the cold efficiency that had made him Alexander's most trusted lieutenant, "I think we need to have an honest conversation about your relationship with Mr. Blackstone." Victoria remained silent, knowing that anything she said could be used against her. "I understand that you've been visiting him during his recovery," Morrison continued. "While your concern is touching, I'm sure you can understand that Mr. Blackstone's condition makes him vulnerable to outside influences. The board is concerned that well-meaning but misguided advice might interfere with his ability to make the complex decisions required to run this company." Victoria finally spoke, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "I've never given Mr. Blackstone business advice. We've mostly talked about books and his recovery." Morrison's smile was cold and calculated. "I'm sure you believe that, Victoria. But consider this from our perspective. A man who doesn't remember his past is being influenced by someone who has no understanding of the complexities of corporate leadership. Someone who might fill his head with simplistic notions about right and wrong that don't apply in the real world of business." The threat was clear, even though it wasn't explicitly stated. Victoria was being warned to stay away from Alexander or face consequences that could extend far beyond losing her job. "Mr. Blackstone is an adult," Victoria said carefully. "He can choose who he wants to spend time with." "Can he?" Morrison asked. "A man with severe amnesia, struggling to rebuild his identity, surrounded by people who claim to have his best interests at heart but might actually be pursuing their own agendas? The board has been discussing the possibility of seeking a conservatorship, having Mr. Blackstone declared mentally incompetent until his memory returns. For his own protection, of course." Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. A conservatorship would give the board complete control over Alexander's decisions, effectively making him a prisoner in his own company. They could force him to sign any document, approve any deal, authorize any action they deemed necessary for the business. However, Morrison continued, if Mr. Blackstone begins making decisions that demonstrate his competence and business acumen, if he shows that he's ready to resume his role as the leader this company needs, then such drastic measures wouldn't be necessary. Do you understand what I'm saying, Victoria? Victoria understood perfectly. She was being asked to choose between Alexander's well-being and her own safety. If she continued to influence him toward compassion and ethical behavior, the board would move to have him declared incompetent. If she stepped back and allowed them to reshape him into his former ruthless self, he would retain his freedom but lose his soul. That evening, Victoria sat in her small apartment, staring at the phone and debating whether to call Alexander. She had his personal number from the hospital, but using it now felt like crossing a line that could put them both in danger. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to know what he was up against. Before she could make her decision, her phone rang. Alexander's voice was tired but warm when she answered. "Victoria, I hope I'm not bothering you at home. I got your number from the hospital directory. I wanted to apologize for being abrupt this afternoon. Today has been rather overwhelming." "You don't need to apologize," Victoria said. "I can only imagine how difficult this must be for you." "I feel like I'm living in someone else's life," Alexander said. "Everyone keeps telling me who I was, what I believed, how I operated. But when I try to imagine myself making the decisions they're describing, I feel sick. Was I really the kind of person who could destroy hundreds of lives for profit? Was I truly so callous about human suffering?" Victoria closed her eyes, feeling the weight of Morrison's threats. "People change," she said carefully. "Maybe you're becoming the person you were always meant to be. But they're pressuring me to be who I was before," Alexander said. "They keep talking about shareholders and fiduciary responsibility, about the need to make tough decisions for the greater good. They make it sound like compassion is a luxury that successful people can't afford." Victoria could hear the confusion and pain in his voice, could sense his struggle to reconcile his instincts with the expectations of everyone around him. She made her decision. "Alexander," she said, "there's something you need to know, something about the pressure you're facing and why it's so important to them that you return to your old ways." She told him about her conversation with Morrison, about the threat of conservatorship, about the board's determination to maintain control over both him and the company. She explained how his former self had built a corporate culture based on ruthless efficiency and moral flexibility, and how his current ethical awakening threatened not just their profits but their entire worldview. Alexander was quiet for a long time after she finished. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a steel that reminded her of his former self, but tempered with something that had never been there before. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I needed to understand what I'm really fighting against." "What are you going to do?" Victoria asked. "I'm going to visit the Riverside site tomorrow, as planned," Alexander said. "And then I'm going to make some decisions about what kind of man I want to be going forward." The next morning, Victoria arrived at work to find the entire 43rd floor in chaos. Alexander had apparently dismissed his security detail and driver, taking a taxi to the Riverside housing complex at dawn. He had spent 3 hours walking through the buildings, talking to residents, seeing firsthand the lives that would be destroyed by his development project. When he returned to the office, he had called an emergency board meeting and announced that Blackstone Industries was withdrawing from the Riverside project. More than that, he was establishing a fund to renovate the existing housing complex and provide job training programs for the residents. The boardroom erupted in shouting that could be heard throughout the floor. Victoria watched through the glass walls as Alexander sat calmly while older men in expensive suits pounded the table and pointed accusatory fingers at him. Morrison's face was purple with rage as he gestured frantically at financial projections and profit forecasts. The meeting lasted 4 hours, and when it ended, half the board members stormed out in fury. Those who remained looked shell-shocked, as if they couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Alexander emerged from the boardroom looking exhausted, but determined. He found Victoria at her cleaning station and asked if they could speak privately. They went to his office, where he closed the door and activated a privacy screen that prevented outside observation. "They're going to try to have me declared incompetent," he said without preamble. "Morrison made it very clear that my decision about Riverside proves I'm not fit to run the company." Victoria felt her heart sink. "What will you do?" Alexander walked to his window, looking out at the city that stretched below them. "I've been thinking about that all day. The truth is, they're probably right about one thing. I'm not fit to run this company. At least not the way they want it run. The man I was before the accident built something monstrous, a machine that devours people and communities to feed the appetites of wealthy shareholders." He turned back to face her, his expression resolute. "But I've realized something important today. I may not remember who I was, but I get to choose who I become. And I refuse to become a monster again, even if it costs me everything." Victoria felt tears welling in her eyes at his words. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm going to fight them," Alexander said. "Not to preserve my position as CEO, but to change what this company represents. I'm going to use whatever power I have left to make amends for the damage my former self caused. And I'm going to need help from people I can trust. He looked directly at her as he said this, the implication clear. Victoria realized that she was no longer just a cleaning lady who had befriended a lost man. She was being asked to become an ally in a battle that would determine not just Alexander's fate, but the fate of everyone whose lives intersected with Blackstone Industries. "They'll destroy both of us," she said quietly. Alexander smiled, and for the first time since his accident, Victoria saw a glimpse of the formidable man he could become. Not the ruthless tyrant he had been, but something new and potentially more powerful. A man with both the resources to create change and the moral conviction to use them wisely. "They'll try," he agreed, "but they've made one crucial mistake. They think they're fighting the broken man who lost his memory. They don't realize they're actually fighting someone who's finally found himself." Victoria looked at this man who had been given the rarest of gifts, a chance to start over, to rebuild himself from the ground up. She thought about her own life, the decades she had spent invisible and overlooked, the small apartment where she lived alone with her memories and regrets. Then she thought about the families in Riverside who would keep their homes because Alexander had chosen compassion over profit. She thought about the 1,200 employees who would keep their jobs because he had refused to see them as disposable assets. She thought about all the future decisions he would face and how her presence might help him stay true to the man he was becoming rather than reverting to the man he had been. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Alexander's smile widened, transforming his entire face. "Help me remember what really matters. Help me stay human in a world that rewards monsters. Help me prove that losing everything I thought I was might be the best thing that ever happened to me." Outside the office windows, the sun was setting over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Victoria realized that she was witnessing more than just the end of another day. She was watching the dawn of something unprecedented, a corporate empire being transformed by the radical notion that profit shouldn't come at the expense of human dignity. The battle ahead would be fierce, and the outcome was far from certain. But for the first time in her 52 years, Victoria Henley felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, standing beside a man who had lost his memory only to find his soul. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.